This is the Garden of English. I'm Tim Freitas, and today we're going to talk about the complexity that we often can explore in characters in literature. So, if you want to know the different ways that we can explore the complexity of character, stick around and check it out. Okay, when talking about literature, especially when we're studying AP literature, but literature in general, we always want to make sure that we address the complexities that show up in the stories themselves. And these complexities show up in settings, these complexities show up in symbols, these complexities show up in point of view, all of the literary elements that are common throughout the literature that we read. Today, what I wanted to do is I wanted to take a few minutes just to focus on the idea of searching for complexities of character. And there are three types of character complexities that you will most often see in literature. The first two that I give you examples for are the most common. The last one, not as common. In fact, it was even kind of hard for me to even think about, but they definitely show up. And so because of that, I wanted to make sure that I just talked about it here, gave you guys a couple questions you could ask to actually try to delve into identifying these elements of complexity, and then we'll just move on. So the first way that you identify complexity in characters in literature is realizing that there are three ways to do it. Okay, so we want to look for characters that are complex based on their layers. Okay, we want to look at characters who are complex based on their contradictory nature, and we want to look for characters that are complex because they are indeed quite paradoxical. Okay, so because of that, we've got three different types of characters that we're looking at. And three different types of characters can still help us get to elements of complexity. So let's actually start with our first one, which is indeed the layered character. The layered character is a way to look at characters that are considered static as also being complex. Now, a static character is a character who pretty much maintains the same character throughout an entire work of literature. Some of the most common static characters that I could think of are Atticus Finch and Benvolio in Romeo and Juliet. Now, just because they're static characters, though, doesn't mean that we can't look at them in their complexity, because they do indeed have layers, okay? I'm going to focus on Benvolio here for my example. If you haven't read Romeo and Juliet, you might want to consider just tossing up the Spark Notes and reading a little bit about Benvolio to kind of be familiar with what's going on. But it's a common read in high school, and I wouldn't be surprised if you got to it eventually. But anyway, so when we think about Benvolio, throughout the entire story of Romeo and Juliet, he pretty much acts the same way. And because of that, we could say he's a static character, he's not very complex, he kind of just fits the same role. Not entirely true, however. And the reason why is because Benvolio, although static in being a good guy, right, exhibits those character traits in multiple ways. So what we would want to do here to delve into his complexity as a character, even though he does maintain a singular role, is to look for the layers of his goodness. And all we want to do is we want to ask, okay, in what different ways do his positive character traits consistently exhibit themselves throughout the story? Well, in the first act, and we see actually through this going throughout the whole story itself, right? We first of all see Benvolio as incredibly helpful, right? He jumps in the middle of Act 1, Scene 1 to help break up a brawl, and he ends up getting involved with it because he's just trying to help. And sure enough, we see that kind of moment coming in where it's like, wow, he seems to be actually trying to maintain the peace. We see him trying to maintain the peace in Act 3, Scene 1 as well. And we see those elements of him trying to work things out with Romeo throughout the book as well, where he's trying to maintain the peace between the families and things of that nature. On top of that, Benvolio is not only this helpful guy who's trying to maintain the peace, we also find out that he's incredibly honest. And we know that he's honest because he's the one at the beginning of Act 1, Scene 1, who's asked to recount for the powers that be what actually happened in the fight in Act 1, Scene 1. So we have the helpful Benvolio, we've got the honest Benvolio, right? And we also realize that Benvolio is an extremely good friend, particularly to Romeo. We have Benvolio trying to find out why Romeo is upset in Act 1, Scene 1. We see him being by Romeo's side through thick and thin throughout the whole story itself. And notice that right there, we've got three different layers of Benvolio. We've got the socially helpful Benvolio. we have the honest Benvolio, and we have the friend Benvolio. And we can look at him, even though they're all positive and good character traits on those three levels, and we could say, wow, he's a pretty complex guy, even if there's not contradictory elements that are involved there. So we have a character with some complexity, even though he is indeed a bit static. Now, is that the most fun type of character to look at? Probably not. But now what we can do is we can analyze his multiple roles in the story and how they kind of fit in together to drive elements of the plot forward or build relationships with other characters or highlight the character traits of others, particularly characters like Tybalt, who he indeed actually is a foil character too. So anyway, that's example number one for layered characters and their complexity. The next type of complexity that we have is the contradictory complexity. And this is when we have characters that seem to have a perception of one way of doing things, and then they actually act in a rather hypocritical manner. The easiest and best character to think about in literature for this would be Holden Caulfield. He spends the entire story blaming everybody else for his problems when really they're his own. He spends the entire story saying that everybody else is a phony, and he's acting rather phony himself. He spends this entire story doing ridiculous things as he's trying to engage into adulthood, and the moment his sister's like, you know what, I agree with you, I'm going with you, he's like, you can't, you're just a kid, you can't do these things, not recognizing that that's also him as well. So we look for these types of characters that are contradictory in nature, and we say, okay, where's the complexity there? And when we see the contradictions in their actions and in their psyche, what we do is we then say, okay, what is bringing out these contradictions? And with someone like Holden, we need to recognize it's the trauma of not having his brother around anymore, both of his brothers around anymore. It's the trauma of having almost every person in his life, in his mind, seemingly leave him and not care about him as he's trying to deal with growing up. And because of that, he's moved to be this kind of hypocrite. Interestingly enough, as a character, he's meant to make us introspective because chances are we are the same way. A lot of times we hold hypocritical and contradictory ideals for ourselves, and then we say other people should be living by those mentalities, and we don't even necessarily do it ourselves. And it's a lot easier to pick out when we see it in other people. So Holden's a character that is indeed contradictory and complex at the same time. Another character that's also that way, that also is going to help us segue into the last version of what we're talking about, is the narrator of The Telltale Heart. Now, if you've never actually checked out the video for that Telltale Heart that actually just chimed in here, I'm going to put a link for that right down in the description because the video is super fun. It's really, really well done. And I show it in my class every year just because it's absolutely excellent. So click on that link down there. Whoever produced it, I'm super grateful. But anyway, the narrator in Telltale Heart fits in this contradictory complexity because as you read, right, the story, you recognize that he is indeed quite mad, but he doesn't actually think that he's mad. And on top of that, he does have these kind of psychopathic and sociopathic tendencies, and yet he also experiences guilt. So you see these contradictory elements showing themselves. He's okay with murdering a guy, and he wants to murder a guy. He feels like he has to murder a guy. Then when he does it, he's dealing with the guilt that's too much. So he's not fully sociopathic and psychopathic, but he is at the same time. And you're kind of trying to navigate through this complexity. And he's got these contradictory elements because, quite frankly, he's extremely brilliant. This guy is brilliant. He would have got away with the murder of the old man if his guilt didn't get the better of him. And he's also terrible because he is indeed a murderer. And the reason why he's a great example for bringing us into our paradoxical complexity is because he's almost a paradox. He's a little bit more contradictory than paradoxical. And because of that, though, this is how we want to study such things. When we talk about this type of a narrator that's contradictory in nature, we want to just try to pull out what are the character traits that seemingly contradict, that can't match up, and therefore what motivates them to act in such a way. And then when we start asking these questions, we can really pull out the complexities of those characters. The last type of character complexity that we should consider is indeed the paradoxical character complexity. And the best example that I have of this doesn't actually come from literature, it comes from Batman, and that is indeed Victor Freeze. I think there was an old Batman animated series called Heart of Ice. If you haven't seen it, make sure that you Google search that and try to see Heart of Ice, because it tells us about the story of a guy who's a villain, but he's not actually a villain. And because of that, as you watch this, you really empathize with him and what he's doing just for the sake of the love that he has with his wife. And it seems as though you're doing the wrong thing, but you're doing the right thing at the same time because you care so much about your wife, and that's what you're holding on to in this world. And because of that, you've got all of these seemingly contradictory feelings, but they're not actually contradictions. And that's what a paradox is. I mean, think about it. A paradox is something that seems to contradict itself, but it doesn't actually contradict itself. And in doing so, it does contradict itself, but it's not a contradiction. Did you catch that? Let me give you an example. If I were to say, this statement is false. Well, if the statement were actually false, that means that the statement were true. But if the statement were true, it would actually make the statement false because the statement is false itself. And because of that, we've got this kind of circular thing going on here. And it's like, what is going on? Yeah, that gets incredibly complex. Mr. Freeze is incredibly complex like that, right? Another character that also kind of goes that route of that almost paradoxical complexity is this guy right here, the Joker, right? So Batman helps us with that a lot, okay? Because we have to see how his brilliance actually matches his maniacal nature, and we can't tell if he's actually being brilliant, even if he planned things, or if it's actually just madness. And because we can't work those things out, it could seemingly be both at the same time, or it could be neither at the same time. It becomes indeed quite a paradox. So anyway, I want you to think about paradoxical characters in literature. The ones that I thought of that show up in literature the most are typically from monotheistic religious traditions. Most characters of God in the major religions have this character trait of being entirely loving, which also then makes them entirely merciful, but also entirely in need of being righteous because of their desire for justice. And at that point, it's how does being all merciful and also demanding justice actually correlate? So if you study characters, the characters of the major monotheistic religions, right, you're going to see that paradoxical elements show up. It's not a contradiction because they can and do indeed work, but it's really complex to figure out, and that's the nature of studying such things. So anyway, as we think about character and as we think about complexity, you've got a lot to look into in your characters, even if they're static throughout stories. So I hope that this was helpful for you, and if it was, I'm going to ask that you click like and subscribe. You can follow the Garden of English on Instagram. You can actually like us on Facebook now too. You can also support us by picking up some merch. We've got posters just like the ones that are behind me. We've got other posters too, by the way. And we also sell t-shirts as well. And those are great ways to support the Garden of English. As always though, these videos are also free. So as long as this is helping you out, I'm going to ask that you help me out in one last way, and that is if you could think of a paradoxical character in a piece of literature that you've read, put it down in the comments. Please enlighten me to some better examples or some easier examples from common literature as well, and that would be quite excellent, so I could actually put those in the conversation the next time somebody asks. Anyway, you all have a great day, and we'll see you next time on the Garden of English.